I want to welcome you back to Government 148, Government and Politics of the Middle East. Last lecture we were discussing Israel, and this lecture we're going to continue with that discussion and resume where we left off. In the last lecture, we covered up to around 1973, and in the present lecture we're going to start with the year 1973. And I call that a watershed year for Israel. If you recall from earlier lectures, there were several years that we designated in those lectures as watershed years. For example, 1948, very important year for Israel. We mentioned 1958, very important year for the United States foreign policy in the Middle East. 1967 was a watershed year for almost all of Middle East and especially Israel, the 1967 June War. And 1973 certainly is also a watershed year. Remember that this was the year in which the Yom Kippur War occurred. Egypt successfully crossed the Suez Canal into the Sinai, and the Israelis were completely shocked and surprised by the Egyptian advances, something they had not expected. So I already mentioned, both in the case of Egypt and Israel, that 1973 is a watershed year, but also for domestic politics of Israel, you can think of the 1973 year as also a watershed year. The shock of a 1973 war in which Israel was caught totally unprepared for the Egyptian invasion really severely undermined the fortunes of the Labor Party and its credibility in the eyes of the Israelis. Perhaps this event can be regarded as the beginning of the end of Labor Party's domination of Israelis' politics. Now, the main beneficiaries of the Labor's political woes was the right-wing coalition known as the Likud Union. So, besides the 1973 war that helped the Likud to come to power later on, there were also other factors working that truly favored Likud's being able to soon take control of Israeli politics. And one of these factors was the changing demographics of the state of Israel. And associated with that change of demographic was the changes in the political compass of the country, moving it in a more conservative direction. To understand this demographic change, we have to understand that by 1970s, early 70s, the Sephardic Jews, these were the Jews that came to Israel, who migrated to Israel from the Middle East and North Africa. They're sometimes called the Oriental Jews. They had, by 1970s, became much more politically participant than they had been during the 1960s. So by 1970s, the Sephardic Jews were a decisive political force that could turn the election one way or the other. And the Sephardic Jews, now much more politically participant and active, they were more attracted to Likud's hardline conservative ideology and their tough agenda vis-a-vis the Palestinian than the Labor's left-leaning views and ideology. This was especially the case as far as the Israelis' relation with the Palestinians were concerned. The Oriental Jews were much more anti-Palestinians than the Ashkenazi Jews, in part because they had come from an area which was too close to their memories, in which they did experience discrimination, although I've said repeatedly that the kind of discrimination that the Oriental Jews experienced in the Middle East, in Arab countries, in Iraq and in Iran and other places, was nowhere as anti-Semitic or as harsh and discriminatory as they had experienced in Europe. Nonetheless, the Sephardic Jews were not very empathetic or sympathetic to the Palestinian. So the synergy of these two factors, the shock of 1973 Arab-Israeli war, together with the political activism and the rise of the Sephardic Jews as a political force, they ended up altering Israel's political landscape in favor of the conservative Likud union. Now, the payoff for the conservatives came during the May 1977 elections. The Likud party was able to defeat the dominant Labour Party, and the Likud leader, Menachem Begin, became Israel's prime minister. So you have, for the first time since the creation of the State of Israel, a non-Labour government who was governing Israel. Now, about a year later, under very, very intense pressures from the United States and President Carter, Prime Minister Begin and Egypt's President Anwar al-Sadat end up signing the Camp David Peace Accord. Now, to save time, these are topics that I already discussed in great depth in our earlier lectures when we covered Egypt, so I can't go in any detail about them here. And also, they are part of your assigned reading, so you should by now be very familiar with these topics, or at least you have the opportunity to make yourself familiar. Therefore, I'm not going to repeat the details here. The fact was that when Begin signed the peace agreement with Sadat, it actually ended up splitting the Arabs, and Egypt really became a pariah state in the Middle East. But for Israel, that was wonderful because it really took the most important Arab country out of the equation as far as Israel's dealing with the Arab and was concerned. So Begin remained prime minister until 1983. He was succeeded by Yitzhak Shamir, his close comrade from their youth days as members of a Zionist terrorist organization known as the Stern Gang. In fact, Shamir is credited as the inventor of the letter bomb, which was used during the Mandate period. So I also mentioned earlier that Begin was not able to set foot in Britain because there was a warrant for his arrest dating back to the Mandate period when the British ruled over Palestine. So we have in succession two former terrorists, Begin and Shamir, serving as Israel's prime minister. That said, remember how strongly Israel oftentimes objects to dealing with terrorists, and yet they elect them as their own prime minister. Anyway, getting back to Shamir, Shamir governed for another year. Then, after that, the Labour made a comeback of a sort. So you can see Labour is now in trouble. During the next couple of years, that is from 1984 until 1986, the Labour Party formed a coalition with Likud and other parties. So really you're not looking at domination of Labour, but a coalition in which Labour's Shimon Peres is serving as a prime minister for 2 years. But then again, in 1986, Shamir ends up winning re-election and returns as a prime minister by having Likud able to form a new coalition with various smaller parties and without much labor help. So all of this domestically is working to the detriment of the Labor Party. So by now you begin to see that Labor is in deep trouble as a political party that used to dominate Israeli politics. Shamir's government lasted for almost 6 years until 1992, when Labor finally was able to make a comeback under the leadership of Yitzhak Rabin. We should note that during Shamir's second administration, the Palestinians were becoming increasingly frustrated by decades of living under Israeli occupation. And they were being pretty much ignored by other Arabs who were now really preoccupied with a different conflict. That was the conflict between Iran and Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war, and therefore they really paid only scant attention to the plight of Palestinians. In fact, it was this neglect by the Arabs, especially the Arabs of the Gulf, to the Palestinian plight that finally convinced the Palestinian that instead of waiting for the world to come to their aid, instead of waiting even for their Arab brothers to deliver them from the Israelis' occupation, they need to take matters into their own hands. So they began an uprising against the Israeli occupation. This uprising became known as the Intifada. In Arabic, Intifada literally means shaking out, but in a more colloquial sense, it oftentimes is translated as an uprising. So the Palestinians really wanted to shake out of this occupation. It is interesting that the Intifada, as it began, was really a grassroots, mostly a spontaneous uprising without really Palestinian Liberation Organization doing any of the planning. So the Palestinian really began to respond in a spontaneous way to their plight. And all of this is occurring at the very end of 1987, beginning of 1988. It not only caught, that is the Intifada, not only caught Israelis by surprise, but also the PLO was caught off guard. And remember, PLO was supposedly the official representative of the Palestinian people. And so in some sense, one could interpret the uprising as also a kind of a warning to the Palestinian Liberation Organization for failing to deliver on their promise of liberation. This uprising, you will see, will continue until 1993, and 1993 is another watershed year because this was the year when the Oslo agreement was finally signed. Now, going back to Israel, the 1992 election was an important one, especially for Labor, because Labor was able to make a comeback. The Labor Party was able to make a comeback under Yitzhak Rabin's helms. Rabin dramatically changed Israel's policy toward Palestinians. When I use the word dramatic, of course, it's context dependent. Given what was happening up to that point, I guess one should consider this a dramatic turnaround. But to understand the magnitude of this policy change, we really need to go back a few years. When the Intifada began in the early 1980s, in 1987, 1988, Rabin at that time was serving as defense minister in the coalition government between Labor and Likud that Shamir was heading. Rabin famously said, quote, "Force, might, and beatings," end of quote, "will be used to put down the Palestinian uprising." In fact, according to the testimony of several Israeli soldiers, Rabin had ordered them, quote, "to break the bones of the Arab militants." Rabin, of course, denied issuing such an order, but he did admit that he had encouraged soldiers to use clubs to suppress protesters. So this should give you a little background that Rabin, a few years back, certainly was very much in the same camp, and his thinking was very identical to the way the more conservative elements were dealing with the Palestinian uprising. That is, you got to quash this uprising and you got to show force. So something happened by 1992 that's going to lead him to change strategy.